Hello, and welcome to the digital launch of the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture in its new home, the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Jennifer Wilkes, and I have the honor of serving as director of the Warfield Center. Established at Florida International University in 1999, the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture honors the late Dr. Eric Williams, scholar, statesman, and head of the government of Trinidad and Tobago from 1956 until his death in 1981. Among numerous books, Williams authored Capitalism and Slavery, published in 1944, the landmark study that has been translated into 10 languages and that is still widely read today. In the University of North Carolina Press edition of Capitalism and Slavery, Colin Palmer, late of Princeton University, describes the book as follows, quote, "Few modern historical works have enjoyed the enduring intellectual impact and appeal of Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. It is a work of conceptual brilliance, intellectually mature, bold, incisive, and immensely provocative. Its publication marked an important watershed in the historiography of the Caribbean, but its ramifications extended beyond the Caribbean. Williams established the centrality of African slavery and the slave trade to the English economy. His conclusions may be rejected, but no serious scholar can avoid confronting the important questions the book poses," end quote. In a similar vein, Duke University professor William Darity has stated that with Capitalism and Slavery, Williams, quote, "managed to produce a work that now has to be considered central in the historiography of slavery and abolition," end quote. The Eric Williams Memorial Lecture continues in this legacy by hosting conversations about global activism and art from Williams's time to the present. The series has moved to UT Austin with the generous support of co-founders Erica Williams-Connell and Dr. Carol Boyce Davies in collaboration with Warfield Center affiliates, Drs. Lorraine Liu and Minkah Makalani. Daughter of the series' namesake, Williams-Connell is the founding curator of the Eric Williams Memorial Collection at the University of the West Indies, Trinidad, and Tobago. Boyce Davies was a professor of African Diaspora Studies and English at Florida International University and is currently Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. The Warfield Center is marking the occasion by curating a collection of interviews with Williams-Connell, Boyce Davies, and previous lecture speakers. These conversations are streaming in conjunction with a digital exhibition celebrating Eric Williams, co-coordinated between the Eric Williams Memorial Collection and UT's Black Diaspora Archive. This week's featured interview is Apex of Change and Intersecting the Academic, Historic, and Political, Sir Hilary Beckles on the international effect of Eric Williams's work. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Minkah Makalani, for speaking with Professor Sir Beckles, and thank Warfield Center Events Coordinator, Justice Madden, for bringing us all together. Finally, thank you for joining the Warfield community as we celebrate the legacy of Eric Williams, reflect on the lecture series History at Florida International University, and prepare for the inaugural UT-based lecture in spring 2022.
Hi, I'm Minkah Makalani, Associate Professor in African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And we are joined today by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the 8th Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, an internationally renowned scholar, public speaker, and playwright, as well as a United Nations committee official and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. Sir Beckles has served as a director of the West Indies Cricket Board and was the founder and former director of the C.L.R. James Center for Cricket Research and founder and chairman of the West Indies Cricket Board's Cricket High Performance Center. In 2013, Sir Beckles was selected by the heads of government of the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, to be the inaugural chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which coordinates the Caribbean government's policy positions on the global reparatory justice conversation and globally promotes reparations for Native genocide, African enslavement, and colonization. In his advocacy for reparatory justice, Sir Beckles has addressed the United States Congressional Black Caucus, the British House of Commons, and the European Parliament on the right to reparations. His 2015 book, Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Slavery and Native Genocide in the Caribbean, is an economic history of the rise of British capitalism in the 17th and 19th centuries that provides the evidentiary basis for the claim for reparatory justice for the genocide of the Native community, the globalization of African enslavement, and the deceptive indenture of Asian workers. So we want to welcome you, albeit virtually, to the University of Texas and the John L.Warfield Center for African and African American Research, and to also thank you for agreeing to participate in the virtual inauguration of the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture here at UT. First, how are you doing?
Well, as well as can be under the circumstances. You know, we're all in difficulty with COVID. I am currently in quarantine. I arrived in Barbados yesterday, and I had to take a COVID test, and I have to self-quarantine until the result is declared. So I'm in quarantine for 4 days. So,
but you don't have COVID.
Fine. No.
Okay, that's good.
No, it's just an immigration procedure. So I hope I don't have it.
Okay, great. Glad to hear that part at least. And I have to say, this is a real honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you. I was actually in Barbados in 2007 for the Association for the Study of the World African Diaspora, and you gave a keynote address. And me and my friends were all pretty enthused by the address and the conversation.
Thank you.
So this is a real pleasure. So we're here to talk about the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture and a little bit about your participation. And I went through my notes and I noted that you were the third lecturer in 2001, but you were also the first Caribbean figure to speak in the series. And so given that, I wanted to ask, particularly given the statue of Dr. Williams, who spent time in the United States teaching at Howard University, but also his standing in the Caribbean. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about his intellectual and political legacy for the Caribbean and the Black world globally.
Thank you very much. First of all, I should say that it was quite an honor to have been invited to deliver that lecture. And the timing was absolutely wonderful, because I had just returned from Durban in South Africa, attending the World Conference on Racism, Xenophobia. And I was so disturbed by some of the significant developments at Durban. Tragically, I was very disturbed by some of the things that happened. And I remember coming away thinking that the world is in a very difficult philosophical and moral state. And I had this inner sense that those debates at Durban were going to be a precursor to something terrible. And then, lo and behold, we had 9/11. And in my mind, the issues were linked. My experience in Durban, 9/11, it was all connected in my head. I felt it. I had kind of almost anticipated a kind of an act of evil. But Everett Williams, of course, is the foundation intellectual of our academia in the Caribbean. And I say that because he was, as you know, the pro-chancellor of my university, the University of the West Indies. He was an architect of the structure of our university, the notion that we should have a multi-campus university across other islands, and we should have a federation of campuses within one university. And he was very clear that the university ought to be taken to the people. The people ought not to come to it, it should go to the people. And he promoted the proliferation of campuses and centers of the University of the West Indies across the region. But also as the quintessential historian who more clearly than any other historian before or since articulated the rise of Western modernity and the role of the Caribbean at the center of that, and the Caribbean as the portal through which Columbus entered the New World and set in place a series of interlocking events that led to the Atlantic world as we know it today, centered primarily around the Caribbean. So his discourse of capitalism and slavery in the Caribbean is the first major analytical discourse on the components and the interlocking relations of those components within what we call today the West. And importantly, moving out of academia and into institutional politics, into constitutional politics, and becoming, in the first instance, a grassroots activist, an anti-colonial intellectual, and an anti-imperialist thinker, and taking that with him into the parliament when he became the first prime minister of the Republic, Trinidad and Tobago. And so he is the triangular interaction of politics, academia, and history. And he sits at the apex of that pyramid. And for us, therefore, he is the carrier of a comprehension of our historical experience and our future journey. So for me and many other scholars in the region, we see his early work as the major stream, and the rest of us are just bringing the tributaries into the mainstream. And my own research as a graduate student dealt with one of those very themes that flowed into his major narrative. Mm-hmm. So for us, therefore, he is, as I said, he sits at the apex of the pyramid of history, academia, and politics. And even more, I think, even more significant, he was able, through his politics, to move the Caribbean along. And when Trinidad became the republic and ending the colonial constitutional stranglehold over the region, or the English-speaking part of it, then of course we were put on the highway to the future.
And I, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of the public lectures that he gave leading up to both PNM and then West Indies Federation, that was known as the University of Woodford Square, which is, for those who don't know, it's a plaza in Port of Spain. And I was able to attend the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture in, I believe, 2004. And George Lemming was scheduled to deliver, but this is a while ago, but I think it was a hurricane or a tropical storm, and so he could not make it. And Edwidge Danticott and another person filled in. But what struck me, this was at the campus of Florida International University, was that this went well beyond the campus community. This seemed to have drawn people from around the Miami area. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your experience and what you saw, because it seemed to capture that same sense of a public-facing event and institution, much like what I imagine his University of Woodford Square lectures. And also you mentioned that you had just come from Durban, and the title of your talk was The Global Politics of Reparations Before and After Durban. So I wondered if you could talk about your experience, what you recall, but then also the topic that you touched on then, because it's become a topic that you've researched and written about for the past 20 years now.
Well, yes. Well, if you begin with those massive grassroots lecture in Port of Spain, Woodford Square, here was the classic paradigm of the hero and the crowd, in which he is the intellectual of the people, not yet invested with constitutional authority, but creating his base, and creating a base that he knew he would march them up against the walls of the British Empire and say, let my people go. So it was that kind of theatrical circumstance. It was almost a Mahatma Gandhi with a massive crowd of people going to the British governor and saying to the governor, well, thank you very much for being over here. You've been here long enough, so you can go back to England and let us get on with our history. But Eric was doing that, and he knew he had touched the nerve, and the people, popular culture was with him, the Calypsonians, the musicians, everyone was supporting this young man who was filled with fantastic oratory, knew like no other the history of British imperialism and what it had done in the Caribbean, and was able to speak with a kind of passion that had typified the anti-colonial struggle from the slavery period into the mid-20th century. So it was a magical moment, and one could imagine, like 200 years earlier, Toussaint Louverture, one could imagine what it would have been like in Port-au-Prince with Toussaint, standing before a crowd. One could imagine also, the young Fidel marching into Havana with this huge celebratory moment of liberation. So the Caribbean is filled with these kinds of interesting moments. And Fidel, Eric, they were all part of that long tradition of Marcus Garvey going back to Toussaint Louverture and so on. So, but importantly, he had returned home as a scholar. And the Caribbean, by virtue of being a colonial space, there was no intellectual tradition. There were intellectuals in the past, but one cannot say that it had cascaded and consolidated into a tradition. And he was bringing it all together, what many others have said, C. R. James, J.J. Thomas in the middle of the 19th century, going back. And he was bringing this all to fruition to say, we have the intellectual and philosophical legitimacy to end colonization, and it's going to begin here in Trinidad, and we are very serious about it. So, one of my favorite moments was when he spoke in London. He had a conversation with the British government about independence, and they were not very receptive. In fact, they were hostile to the idea that he had the audacity to bring independence before the British government as a reality. And they gave him a pretty warm time, and he left Westminster and went over to the London School of Economics to give a lecture to West Indian students in London. And he used a metaphor. He says, the British government does not care for the Caribbean. They see us as an orange. They have sucked us dry, thrown the peel onto the ground, and their only concern now is that they will slip and fall upon it. And that statement really resonated with people, and the idea of islands being sucked dry by imperialism. And now in the mid-20th century, when there's no more slavery, there's no more indenture, that they now have to start paying for the resources of the region. And they were outraged by the notion of the colonial emergence. And the idea of being sucked dry and thrown upon the ground appealed to many people as the perfect metaphor. So when I came out of Durban, having faced the same wrath that he had faced 50 years earlier, where the British delegation led by Baroness Amos, who was a Tony Blair functionary, who looked at us across the room and said, Britain has done nothing wrong, and there's nothing to apologize for. Slavery was legal. When we, the British, practiced it, it was legal. And therefore, there is no criminality involved in any of it. So Britain would not apologize for any of that. And that was so emotionally difficult, because here is a beautiful Black woman from the Caribbean looking at the Caribbean delegation in the face and saying that we, the British, have done nothing wrong, you know, and would not apologize. Yeah. So that was the first wound that went through the heart. The second one was the betrayal by some of the African heads of states who sided with the West, sided with the Europeans to shut down the reparatory justice conversation. And but we understood that history is filled with circumstances in which the citizens clash with their own leaders. And in West Africa, much of the politics was nation against citizens. That the political leaders, many of them, were not representing the opinion of their citizens. Mm-hmm. And we knew that because next door to the intergovernment forum was a civil society forum. So in the civil society forum with the trade unionists, the grassroots people, the activists, the teachers, the priests, the students, next door, they were all in celebration of the reparatory justice moment. But in the forum where I spoke with the heads of state, these critical African leaders were saying something that was very, very different to what the citizens were saying next door. But wow. we knew how to analyze that. Mm-hmm. We knew they were not speaking for their countries. They were speaking for their elite class interests, and we understood that. So I did say to myself, how would Eric Williams have conceptualized all of this? And I thought he would have been magnificent in explaining the intricacies of capitalism and its divisiveness, and how popular opinion has to rise up against the state, and how governments that represent their personal interests always run afoul of the masses of people. And I thought he would have been a great theoretician. So I arrived in Florida to give the lecture after all of that, and I could feel his presence. I could feel his intellectual comprehension of the situation. And I drew very heavily upon what I thought would have been his perspective. And the night before the lecture, I read two of his books. The very small one, the Negro in the Caribbean, that is the first discourse about Black intellectuals in the region and the future and the potential. Then, of course, I read Capitalism and Slavery, because I thought that capitalism and slavery, and then what? You know, the famous C.L.R. James question, you do what you have to do, and then what? So capitalism, slavery, and then what? So it was clear to me that it was capitalism, slavery, and then reparations. And not too long after, about 5 years after, I was invited by my alma mater, the University of Hull, to participate in the creation of the William Wilberforce Institute for Slavery and Emancipation. As you know, the British government had given a substantial amount of money to establish that institute. And it's the Wilberforce Institute for Slavery and Emancipation. The acronym is WISE. And we were at 10 Downing Street at the Prime Minister's residence at a reception to officially launch WISE. And I was asked to say a few words, you know, having a drink of wine and say a few words. And I said, well, you know, WISE is good. WISE is good. The Wilberforce Institute, Slavery, Emancipation, WISE is good. But if we had agreed to call it the Wilberforce Institute for Slavery, Emancipation, and Reparations, then the acronym would have been WISER. And I put that on the table as a legitimate departure. And I remember—
And how was it received?
I remember the officials of the British government were spilling their wine on their jackets, and you know, this man has come from the Caribbean to undermine British political policy on slavery and emancipation. And they thought, absolutely not. No, we don't want WISER. We just want WISE. And I have been pushing for WISER ever since.
Okay. So that kind of leads into my next question, because as I was preparing for the conversation and looking at your work and some of the work you've done and your writing over the past 20 years, it did strike me that there seems to be a resonance or a line from capitalism and slavery to what you're doing now. And I know in the US context, a lot of people do encounter in various contexts C.L.R. James's classic, The Black Jacobins, about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. Fewer have encountered on their own or in university Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, but I think that's increasing now. More people are reading it in classes, and I think it's circulating, particularly after the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. It seems to have gained an increasing deal of currency in US African American and Black studies context. But you know, we don't stay in 1944. We kind of take it and we kind of move it forward. A number of people have done that, and I think you're doing it as well. So I wonder, how has your thinking about reparations and your approach to the question maybe evolved, changed, become either more moderated or maybe more emboldened in this period, and particularly since you've begun to work as the chair of the CARICOM committee?
Well, the story begins as an undergraduate student, and recall that my undergraduate program was in economic history, and I found myself in that economic history program, again, largely because of Eric Williams. So here I am, 17 years old, off to college to pursue a bachelor's degree in philosophy. And within the first semester, I chose a program that looked at the philosophical and political underpinnings of the rise of slavery, largely dealing with the writings of John Locke and other European political philosophers who had legitimized the concept of slavery. And I presented a seminar on capitalism and slavery. Oh. And I remember my academic leader told me that I had chosen a text that was not relevant because capitalism and slavery, he said, is not history, it is protest writing. It is not scholarship, it is protest writing. And this is a book that had emerged out of Williams' PhD dissertation, and which I knew was one of the finest pieces of scholarship ever written. So it was a racial moment, but it was also the moment when I thought that I needed to change my major, because I could not go through 3 years of hearing that kind of racist narrative. And almost every book that I quoted, Williams, James, Du Bois, almost everything I was quoting in my essays and so on was being dismissed as not scholarship, protest. This is stuff for the political platform. This is not stuff for the classroom. So I came face to face with institutional racism in the British Academy. So I shifted my major into economic history, into precisely the Eric Williams theme. The rise of industrial capitalism in Europe and the Atlantic world, how did this happen? Capitalism, imperialism, the use of the colonies to generate investments for domestic deployment. So I shifted, rather than run away from Williams, I actually ran towards him and changed my major to embrace what he did. So I became a Williams student in the Department of Economic History. And fortunately for me, the professors in economic history were far more welcoming of that kind of work. Wow. So I graduated in that department, coming up in the top echelons of the class. And then they gave me a scholarship to pursue a PhD. My department, they gave me a pretty good scholarship and says, listen, do a dissertation, do a PhD. And I chose capitalism and slavery because one of the principal sub-thesis in capitalism and slavery was the rise of the specific historical moment in which chattel slavery asserted market dominance over all other forms of labor, and how it pushed aside white indentured servitude as the principal system of labor in the founding of the colonies. So my dissertation, therefore, was to examine the specific economics of that transition. At what moment precisely, run the numbers, at what moment precisely in the Caribbean was it more profitable for a plantation owner, a slave owner, to purchase an enslaved African as opposed to an indentured European? And what was his business calculation? What were the variables that he or she would have made to suggest that this is now not only a rational choice, but it was an economic choice? It gave a greater return. So I ran the numbers on that moment. So my dissertation looked at the period between 1640 and 1660, where chattel slavery transcended indentured servitude, and the switch took place, and how it took place, and so on. So I spent 3 years examining that precise moment and running the economic numbers on the slave owner's choice, on the plantation owner's choice, and was able to demonstrate conclusively that Eric Williams was correct, that it wasn't necessarily because the plantation owner was a racist and hated Black people and therefore wanted to enslave them. It was that that might have been in his mind, but at the moment he made the choice, he was functioning as a rational businessman making a market choice that was in his bottom line interest. And they made the poor white people unemployed. So they drove working class white people into the margins of the economy, pushed them into unemployment, marginalized them, drove them into poverty in order to make room for the influx of thousands of Africans. So you can very well imagine that the average plantation owner would not have been personally satisfied with the fact that his decisions were rendering working white men and women irrelevant and ending whatever future they thought they had in the colony, but driving them into despair. They certainly had a problem with that, but the business survival made it necessary, and they did what their bottom line required. So my dissertation, therefore, was a validation of one of the first of the many theses that exist within the Williams thesis. So fast forward, so let's say that's the beginning of Williams, the rise of slavery, that's the beginning. So I was there at the beginning, and as I was there at the beginning, I'm now here at the end. So, you know, the notion I was there at the beginning and now I'm here at the end. So I'm here at the end where, and what is next? Capitalism and slavery, and what is next? Reparations. And so when I wrote Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Native Genocide and Slavery, it was written in my mind as the last chapter of capitalism and slavery. And I imagined that had Williams been alive 20, 30 years later, he would have seen that the logical implication of the extraction of wealth from people and the region through slavery and colonization, because he had said it on many occasions that Britain has a debt to repay. And if he thought that it was a debt to be repaid, and he said that in the 30s, he said it in the 40s, even before he went to Oxford, when he was a young activist, he made the point clear in some of his early speeches, and he made some very good speeches in London when he was a student. He would come up from Oxford and spend time with C.L.R. James and George Padmore and the Black intellectuals in London. And some of the speeches he gave in his student days were calling for a development Marshall Plan strategy for the Caribbean. And having sucked it dry, as he said, they need to put it back. Otherwise, the people of the Caribbean would have no future. Because he couldn't imagine, like Sir Arthur Lewis, that the Caribbean could move to sustainable economic development without a British Marshall Plan. And he was part of that group that had demanded that Britain develop a reparation strategy, a Marshall Plan after the Second World War, to enable the Caribbean islands to move from colonization into nationhood with a significant investment. What Williams used to call the golden handshake, that each colony, in leaving their empire, that Britain had the duty to give it a golden handshake. And that golden handshake was a capital investment to launch them into nationhood as a payback in part for the wealth that had been extracted through slavery and colonization. So I would say that Britain's Black Debt, the language in it, the paradigm, the rhythm of the writing, all of that, I mean, the writing of Williams, it has tremendous energy, it has bounce, it goes along like a river which is running down the mountain towards the ocean, and it has that energy you know, and to be able to capture that sense of momentum and escalation of energy in your writing, I try to capture some of that in Britain's Black Debt as a tribute to Eric and his style and his intellectual focus and strategy. So yes, so my first book, which looks at the rise of slavery in the Caribbean in the 17th century, that was Williams in the beginning, and my book on reparations was Williams at the end. So I kind of became like a book end for Williams, you know. So that tells you how I feel about him.
Nice, thank you for that. And just in imagining what it must have been like for you to say that the name of the Wilberforce Institute should have been wiser at 10 Downing Street. I'm getting a real big chuckle out of that internally,
that was the best place to say it.
But I
remember Sherry Blair, you know, I spoke after she did. I remember Sherry Blair, her eyes just rolled over.
No, and I read as well your address to Parliament and the forcefulness in which you made many of the claims about reparations and reparatory justice and the responsibility that Britain had for the Caribbean and the nature of justice in this kind of context. And I found it really compelling. And I also thought that it did seem to echo that sense of that you see in Williams's writing and his speeches, his willingness to speak very directly and frankly to those who are in power, even if he's also being diplomatic and trying to negotiate certain kinds of relationships and a certain kind of political future. But more recently, and in particular this past summer with the video footage of the police officer in Minnesota who killed and really lynched George Floyd, and the global protest that rose up around both his murder or his killing, but also the routine killing of Black people. You had released a video where you were talking about it, and it struck me that you were, I presume, in Barbados when you recorded it.
Jamaica.
In Jamaica, okay. That's right, because you're now at UE in Mona, if I'm correct, right?
Yes, my office as Vice-Chancellor is at the Mona campus in Jamaica. Okay.
But it struck me that you were speaking from that place, from the Caribbean, and not from anywhere in the US. And me as someone who's grown up here and I've been elsewhere, but this is home. I was struck by this one passage that you had. And so I just want to read the quote very briefly. And you say, quote, as historians, we have a responsibility to connect the dots and to show that indeed these developments, the recent expression at the loss of George Floyd from our family, is indeed a Caribbean cause. The struggle is a Caribbean struggle. And it's important to look at the context within which all of this has occurred. And I raise this specifically because we're having a conversation. This is very fresh in, I think, everyone's consciousness, particularly as we still exist within a pandemic. But we also, we were one military official away from potentially being under military rule in the US. And that's one of the very scary things to think about, this past year. But also in thinking about these connections that we can chart. So Eric Williams teaching at Howard University and the place that Howard University has in Black intellectual culture and Black history. CLR James spending time in the US at 2 different points in time. The interplay between activists from, say, the Black Power movement between the Caribbean, the US, Canada, so the Montreal Writers' Conference in '68, the Institute for the Black World, inviting people like Walter Rodney to give lectures and organize, Sylvia Wynter being there as well. So it strikes me that this statement from you, the whole thing, but that statement in particular, does have some bearing on the importance of the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture being in the US, first at Florida International, and given the Caribbean community there, how that was a kind of a communal institution, and now being at the University of Texas, which Austin has a much smaller Black and much smaller Caribbean community than Miami, but Black Studies at the University of Texas has really taken up the diaspora. And in light of the ethical and political questions that you're raising about the demands for reparatory justice, both in general over the past 20 or so years, but also in that video and how it ties to so much of what you said. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of that connection, but also having something like the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture being in the US, which isn't to make these kind of national claims, but to maybe talk about what it means for these connections, because of the language you use, like Eric Williams was taken from our family, and that this struggle is a Caribbean struggle.
Well, you know, Eric Williams should be everywhere. And in the US South, in Texas, I cannot think of a better place, because capitalism and slavery, the paradigm was everywhere.
Yes.
So everywhere there was capitalism and slavery, everywhere there should be Eric Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And in the deepest South of the United States, that is as good a location as any, because the plantation America is what this is all about. It is about Black people trying to rescue themselves from the evil of plantation America. And plantation America started in the Caribbean. And from the Caribbean, it moved south to Suriname, it moved through the Guyanas, it moved into Brazil to some extent, but it certainly moved north, and first of all into South Carolina. That becomes the diaspora of the Caribbean. South Carolina is the first colony with a Black majority because it was invested and settled, owned and managed by the West Indian slave owners. The Barbados slave owners and the Jamaica slave owners built South Carolina as their home on the mainland. So this migration of ideas and people and systems represents the evidentiary basis of capitalism and slavery. And therefore, when Caribbean slave owners took their Africans north and spread them out across the mainland and connected the islands to the mainland, and island and mainland became integrated beautifully in much the same way that the indigenous people had done so. The indigenous people were moving through the islands, through Florida, up the East Coast, down through the islands into Mexico. Mm-hmm. So the relation between the islands and the mainland organic. It was a common survivor spread out from the Caribbean across the space of North America, and therefore capitalism and slavery becomes a norm. Now imagine therefore that George Floyd is at the end of that journey. I mean, his foreparents might very well have originated in Jamaica and taken to Carolina or Virginia, and we don't know these things. But what we do know is that the river of bliss was flowing up from the islands into the mainland. Thousands and thousands of Africans having that experience of mainland and understanding at one island. At the next moment, they're from the mainland, but there's a common legacy. So when we speak of the George Floyd moment as a Caribbean moment, it is because we historians are aware that the slave system that took root on the mainland, from Miami to Minneapolis and right across to Memphis, all of that had roots in the Caribbean. So we have to own it. We, the Caribbean folks, have a legitimacy. We have to own this evil because it's first dropped on our heads. Then it dropped on the heads of our cousins. So the notion of ownership is important. So my argument was to say to the people of the Caribbean, you know, don't watch CNN and think that this is an American issue. No, this is not an American issue. Don't sit on your sofa in the islands and say, this is terrible. It's terrible, but it's an American tragic circumstance. Own it. This is ours. This is ours, and it had always been ours. And the policeman today was the plantation overseer of yesterday. And so you move from the plantation into the police department. You move from being an overseer and a slave driver, and you move to being a police officer, and you bring the consciousness of Black life with you. The notion that Black life was dispensable, you know, it means nothing. It's just another variable on the accounts of the plantation book. So what happened to Brother George had been happening to millions of young men across plantation America, from the US through the islands into Brazil and into Argentina. This has been the norm, just that we had an opportunity to watch it live and direct, as opposed to reading about it in the archives. And I can tell you, when I started my doctoral research on the economics of slavery, and I had to do all of the economic modeling, prices, productivity, efficiency, mortality, I had to be measuring all of those issues, that the average African who comes to the Caribbean would live no more than 7 years, that 30% of them would die in the Middle Passage, and those who survive would give about 7 to 10 years of labor, and then they would die and you replace them. And it was cheaper to burn them out in a decade and replace them than to treat them with care and extend their lives. To extend their lives into 20 years was not financially sustainable for the slave owner. It was best, given the prices on the slave markets, it was best to extract maximum productivity through 18 to 20 hours of labor per day, burn them out and replace them. So I did the economics of that. And therefore, when I entered the archives, I was 21 years old when I started all of this. And I used to sit in the archives and cry. I wasn't prepared for that.
Yeah.
I had no counseling. There was no psychological preparation. I'm just sitting in this archives, going through these documents and these plantation accounts and merchants accounts and the profitability of cotton production, the profitability of sugar production. And I'm just looking at the numbers, man, and I'm thinking, my God, you know, these are my people. So it was extremely emotional at 21. You know, I guess you're like a junior doctor when you enter the hospital for the first time and you seeing body parts hanging around the place, and you see surgery, open hearts, and there's blood, and you're seeing for the first time, you know, and you freeze because, my God, this is a human being. But then later on, you get tougher, and you are able to be, you know, what they say, objective and scientific, and you can look at it and so. So over time, I learned how to handle reading those documents without having an emotional meltdown. But at the same time, my brain is getting sharper and sharper in its comprehension. And so when I saw that video of Brother Floyd, it brought back all of the memories of my first encounter in the archives of slavery.
Wow.
The feeling and the passion. So the same feeling came, but I had enough control to say what I want to say without, breaking down.
Wow.
So, and I knew that Eric Williams had walked that road. He walked that road, and that is why you were able to identify that passion in his writing and his speeches, because he was not prepared to sacrifice his commitment to speaking truth, to finding a resolution. And you have to understand that there's always that choice. You want to negotiate something. You want to negotiate a short-term victory. You want to negotiate a long-term victory. You want to negotiate some kind of advancement. And there's always that tendency to speak meek and mild to the oppressor, hoping that the oppressor would have some moral response and enable some kind of support for a better way. That is one tradition. And then there's the other tradition of speaking the truth as you see it, regardless of the consequences, and also believing that speaking the truth firmly and without watering it down, that you actually lay the foundation for the next generation to take up their struggle. And you have to choose which of those options you believe is better: to speak the truth fully and completely for the benefit of those alive and for the education of those to come. Whether you water it down, whether you go into a process of intellectual mitigation and you find yourself, as we would say in the Caribbean, speaking from both sides of your mouth, and you're speaking from both sides and your audience don't know what you're trying to say. So you have to choose, and Williams chose. And in his choice, and he paid their price. An example of how he paid that price was when he was going to England to discuss the constitutional independence of Trinidad and Tobago and the rise of the nation. What we now have are the letters written by the British High Commissioner in Trinidad. And the British High Commissioner is writing to the British government to say, Eric Williams is coming to London to discuss the independence of his country. And you must show him no respect. This is the author of Capitalism and Slavery. This is the man who said that our magnificent industrial culture was built on slavery, and it emerged from the drinking from the well of black blood. This is the man who said those things in his book. And so on. So he was setting up Williams so that when he arrived in London to speak with the Prime Minister, the room was poisoned with toxic attitudes towards Williams. And Williams went to England and walked into a morgue, walked into a cold environment where they wanted to show him that if you are going to write a book like that about us and you expect help from us, absolutely not. Get back on the airplane and go back to Trinidad. No support. So he paid a dear price as a political leader, as a human being. He paid a dear price for being able and willing and keen to speak frankly and freely and to tell the truth. He paid a price. So I remember also too, as a student in a seminar, there was this very distinguished British historian, and he had published a book on the rise of the Victorian state, that this is a rise of democracy in the Victorian state. The Victorian state is a state that inaugurated parliamentary democracy and liberalism, and it is the home of the modern democratic ethos. And he presented his book, and I was just a student. I was sitting in the back row. The professors were in the front. I'm in the back row just listening. And after a while, I became so irritated by this triumphalism of Victorian democracy and this idealism of the British state. And I said, excuse me, can I make a statement? And the chairman of the seminar said, yes, and introduced me as a student. And I said, Professor, this state that you are celebrating and you know, this triumphalism of the Victorian model of two-party democracy, is this the same state that massacred thousands of working class people in Jamaica in 1865 because they were hungry and they squatted on government land to plant foods and were massacred by the British Army? Is this the same state that massacred the Indian people in 1857? Is this the same state that committed atrocities against the indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand? Is this the same state that is slaughtering Black people and brown people all over the world? And we can measure the massacres that the British Army is conducting. Is this the same state? I said, if it's the same state, it is obviously schizophrenic. It has two faces. It has one for the people at home and one for the people overseas. It has one face for Black folks and one for white folks. So, so it's either schizophrenic or you are not telling us about the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you, I thought for a moment I was going to lose my scholarship. There was silence in the room. There was silence in the room, and the professor could not answer my question.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that, oh my God, there I go again, open up my big mouth, and they're going to take away my scholarship because I have now embarrassed a visiting professor. But I was so surprised when after the seminar, my own supervisor, distinguished British historian, called me into his office, offered me the cup of tea, and said, young man, now you know why we gave you the scholarship. So there you go. There you go. So, you know, Williams and the Williams legacy was multiple dimensions, speaking truth to power, writing the facts as they are.
Right.
No sugarcoating of history, precisely analyzing history, and a generation that came after him inspired by his what I call the triple C: the caring, the courage, and the commitment. So he cared for us. You know, he was committed to the Black struggle, right? And he was confident and courageous in his efforts. He truly was a gladiator. So, you know, he is for me what I call the man standing at the apex of the pyramid.
Wow. And did you ever have an opportunity to meet Dr. Williams?
I will tell you a story, and you promised me not to repeat it, but you can share it with your audience.
Okay.
You can share. When I was 20 years old, I returned to the Caribbean from the UK to do some research in the archives across the islands, and I went to Port of Spain in Trinidad. And a friend of mine back in the UK told me that when I got to Port of Spain, I could stay with his family while I was working in the Trinidad archives. And I was staying with his family. And as it turned out, his father was a minister of finance in Williams' government.
Oh, wow.
So I am sleeping on the sofa in the living room, you know, saving a few pounds that were scarce.
Yeah.
And about 3 a.m., the telephone rang, and it was right next to the table, on the table where I was sleeping on the sofa. And not wanting it to wake up my host, I answered the phone and I said, Mr. Pravat's residence. And this voice was bellowing, is this Pravat? I said, no, sir. I'm a house guest. He said, okay, could you tell Mr. Pravat to bring me file number so-and-so to my office straight away? I recognized that voice. It was the Prime Minister. It was the Prime Minister. And I went and I knocked on the bedroom. And Mr. Pravat opened his eyes and I said, I'm sorry, sir, I'm sorry for waking you up, but the Prime Minister would like you to bring file number so-and-so. And he just put on his robe, knocked the robe, took the file, got in his car and drove down to the Prime Minister's office, came back half an hour later, said, good night, Hilary, get some sleep, and went back to bed. That was my first encounter with Eric Williams, first and last. The second encounter was more distant. I was in the archive, and many of the old historical archives were in the building where the Prime Minister's office was located. So when he was writing his history books, he would send down to the library archive on the ground floor, and they would carry books up to his office so he could do his historical writing. So I filled out the form and I gave it to the librarian, the archivist, and she looked at it. She went into the catalog, and then she came back and she said, oh, I'm so sorry, it's not available. It's not available, and pointed that it's upstairs to the Prime Minister. And I said, okay, thank you very much. I will come back tomorrow. So those were my only two symbolic engagements with him. But I really wish I had had the opportunity, you know, because he certainly would have helped me to understand many things. But at that moment, he was in the midst of his political turbulence.
Oh, right.
And he was transitioning from activist historian to statesman. Mm. And he was given very few interviews because the critique of capitalism and slavery by European and North American historians, largely by white Western academia, the critique of his work, he found it to be offensive. Many of the things that they wrote and said about capitalism and slavery, he found offensive. He found that many of these people were not genuine scholars. They were not real scholars. Look at the nonsense that they're writing. And he felt that they were carrying some racism along with them. So he was retreating from engaging, even by letter, questions from graduate students, from professors, and so on. A few people had access to him. A few people had access, but he had virtually closed that door to the next generation.
Okay. Well, Sir Hilary Beckles, thank you so much for your time, your generosity, and your insights. I really appreciate you being with us virtually. Hopefully everything gets to the point where we can travel at some point soon, and I will have a chance to run up on you in Barbados.
Yes.
I'll send you an email maybe, and hopefully you would take an audience. But thank you so much for your time.
No, the honor is mine. It's been a pleasure speaking with you on this interesting matter. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day.